My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 39 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the CFO of Hawthorne Technologies, one of the most respected companies in Silicon Valley. I lived for that job, sleepless nights, cold coffees, and a quiet pride in having built something from nothing. I never imagined my career would end in a chilly conference room, with 4 executives looking at me as if I were just a line crossed out from the budget. The vice president, Richard Davis, kept his voice calm, almost rehearsed. "Ethan, it's a strategic decision. We need to make room for a new vision." New vision. I already knew what that meant. He was about to promote his son-in-law, Ryan Mitchell, a smug 28-year-old kid more concerned with Italian suits than numbers. Nepotism had finally beaten meritocracy. I signed the papers without arguing. There was no glory in begging for dignity from those who didn't deserve it. But something inside me burned in silence, a cold, rational anger. I left that room with the serene expression of someone who'd lost, but the eyes of someone who hadn't given up yet. Hours later, I sat in the empty parking lot staring at the badge in my hands. That wasn't just a piece of plastic. It was my life being shut down. But when I connected my laptop one last time, something caught my attention. A forgotten folder on a restricted server. The name? Project Aegis. I opened the file, and what I saw there changed everything. Inside that folder were records of an undeclared investment portfolio created when I still headed the department. Total value? $480 million. Hidden, forgotten, invisible, and technically, mine. The irony made me smile for the first time in days. While they celebrated my firing, I was about to become more powerful than any of them. I closed the laptop, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Thank you, Ryan. You've just given me the perfect reason to come back." The rain began to fall on the car window, and the sound of the drop sounded like a clock ticking the start of the countdown. Revenge, I realized, isn't made of screams or fury. It is born from silence. I just needed time. And now I had all the money in the world to buy it. The following days were a mix of euphoria and paranoia. I knew what I had in my hands. A secret capable of toppling empires and creating new ones. The investment portfolio was structured under an old holding company, Aegis Capital, registered in the Cayman Islands. I remembered it well. It was a project I created for a merger that never happened. Technically, no one owned it. Legally, that could be interpreted in many ways. I spent hours analyzing every transaction. Most of the assets were distributed across emerging startups, energy contracts, and minority stakes in tech funds. The irony was cruel. All those investments still belonged to Hawthorne Technologies, but without public record. I decided to move everything before anyone noticed. With the help of an old contact in New York, Michael Reed, I activated the holding and redirected the portfolio to a fund under a new name, EC Holdings. A simple, discreet name, like I always was. With each click, I felt the old submission give way to something new, power. But power is a slow-acting drug. First, it gives purpose, then addiction. I knew that if I crossed that line, there would be no turning back. Even so, I crossed it. I called Claire Bennett, my ex-analyst, the only person I still trusted. "Claire, I need you to meet me. It's important." She hesitated, but agreed. When she showed up at the downtown cafe, her eyes mixed concern and curiosity. "You're playing with fire, Ethan," she said when I explained the basics. "This could land you in jail, or it could put me back on top." The truth is, I didn't want justice. I wanted balance, and sometimes balance costs dearly. When I left the cafe, I realized there was no turning back. I had left the man I was behind, the exemplary employee, the corporate idealist. Now, I was the architect of my own redemption, and the corporate world would soon discover that no one fires a man like me without paying the price. The following days taught me something about power. It doesn't shout, it whispers. While Hawthorne announced Ryan as the new face of financial innovation, I watched it all in silence from the penthouse I rented in Manhattan. The city outside pulsed like a living organism, full of people chasing dreams, and I there, planning a ruin. Claire became my confidant. Smart, methodical, and loyal, she helped me track transactions the new director was manipulating to hide embezzlements. "They're laundering bonuses disguised as R&D investments," she whispered one night as we analyzed spreadsheets. "Perfect," I replied. "Every lie needs an audience to fall." I began recording everything, every data point, every meeting, every movement. I knew that when the time came, I would need to show their collapse in an epic and strategic way. Sometimes I caught myself looking at the city's reflection in the glass and thinking, how many people have already been destroyed by an injustice like mine? How many Ethans are out there, swallowing anger and pretending everything's fine? If you're reading this, and you've felt that pain, of being betrayed at work, of seeing your efforts stolen, know one thing. Revenge isn't the end. It's the restart the system didn't expect. And maybe the story will inspire you to look differently at the power that still exists inside you. Ryan had no idea that his enemy wasn't outside. He was in the spreadsheets, the contracts, the reports he inherited and didn't understand. I would let him dig his own grave. And when he was at the bottom, I would throw the first handful of dirt. 3 months passed. I already owned 7% of Hawthorne shares, acquired discreetly through intermediaries. No one suspected. The market saw a mysterious new investor who seemed to know exactly when to buy. I knew, of course. I was the ghost inside the system I created myself. Claire called me late at night. "Ethan, I found something." On the shared screen, an internal document showed that Ryan had authorized an illegal transfer of $50 million to an offshore account. "They're making the same mistake you called out years ago," she said. "No," I corrected. "They're making a worse mistake. They forgot who taught the rules." As she spoke, a dangerous idea began to form. What if I didn't just expose them, but destroy them publicly, turning their fall into a spectacle? The kind of fall that becomes a headline, a case study, and a lesson.
I contacted Mark Luce, an investigative journalist at Bloomberg, under a pseudonym. I sent just one sentence and an attachment. "Corruption isn't born from thieves. It's born from heirs. EC." The next day, the first article came out. Small, discreet, almost invisible, but enough to shake the market. Hawthorne shares dropped 4% in one morning. Richard and Ryan called an emergency meeting. I, sitting in my office, watched the intercepted internal broadcast through a contact. Richard was yelling, Ryan was sweating, and I, with a glass of whiskey in hand, just smiled. The war had begun, but I knew we were still in the preliminaries. True destruction requires patience and a touch of class. I summoned Marcos Lobo to a meeting at a discreet restaurant in the financial district. He had the air of someone who knows all the world's shortcuts and eyes that weighed promises. I explained the plan without beating around the bush. Gradual acquisition, controlled exposure, surprise assembly. Marcos smiled, a smile that didn't say if it was alliance or trap. I left the table with the feeling that every alliance has an uncertain price. Claire brought me confidential documents that only someone inside could access. There were emails suggesting complicity between the board and suppliers. As I reviewed them, I felt the weight of responsibility and the bitter taste of revenge. We decided to filter the evidence for the exact moment when the market's eyes were on us. Precision became our weapon, patience our ammunition. Meanwhile, share purchases continued through trusts and friendly brokerages. With each 1% conquered, I breathed easier, and Hawthorne felt a tremor. Ryan gave interviews trying to calm investors, but the questions always circled back to the same point. I realized that the best revenge is to make the fall of the untouchable inevitable, and I was reaching the tipping point. On a rainy night, Marcos handed me a contact in Jersey City, a lawyer who would understand the legal loopholes. "Don't touch what you can't prove, but also don't hesitate to pay to hold key pieces," he said. I paid lawyers, hired independent auditors, and protected our tracks. The line between justice and crime grew thin, but I followed a code: expose the truth, minimize collateral damage. And in the silence after the storm, I planned the next move. On the morning the first more incisive article came out, the trading floor recorded a sharp drop. Hawthorne's corridors filled with whispers and hastily closing doors. I received reports via Claire as if they were notes from a speed chess game. Ryan's eyes, in live images, reflected something I already knew: poorly disguised panic. I felt a contained victory because there was still much to lose and gain. Richard called an emergency meeting and tried to control the damage. I watched arrogance turn to tension and the security of position dissolve into pleas for calm. Meanwhile, I discreetly increased another slice of steak, always through channels that left no direct traces. The press now had an appetite for more. I regulated the flow of information with parsimony. Exposing too much too soon spoils the effect. Exposing too late gives room for counterattacks. Camila was fired in a public act that seemed like a corporate soap opera scene. The difference is, there they weren't actors, they were reputations being dynamited. I sent discreet protection to her and instructed her to remain silent until further notice. The separation hurt me more than I planned to admit. Trust has a cost. Still, I kept the focus. The assembly was approaching, and I needed aces up my sleeve. As internal investigations began, I realized my movements were being monitored. Someone was paying for intelligence reports, watching suspicious investors. That meant I was no longer just fighting a son-in-law, I was fighting an entire apparatus. But the enemy's apparatus revealed weaknesses, and I would exploit them with cold precision. The war was just getting more interesting. I sent the journalist a second batch of documents with surgical care, small attachments, clean metadata, and a narrative no one could ignore. The article came out like a fragmentation bomb. It hit multiple targets, toppled reputations, and left Hawthorne's corridors in a state of siege. While executives took turns in interviews, I watched the volatility of quotes with an almost obsessive calm. Each drop was part of the map I had drawn. However, I realized that revenge and consequence walk arm in arm. By destroying their pedestal, I also destabilized relationships that could be useful to me later. Still, there was no regret, just the certainty that it needed to be done. The internal reaction was swift. Covert investigations, accounting reviews, and an operation to discredit sources. I was accused in an internal report of influencing the market and listed my name as a possible instigator, even without concrete proof. They knew I could make noise, but they didn't know how much I could control the game. I entered and exited my transactions with a surgeon's discretion, always one step ahead of those trying to track my moves. Claire and I fine-tuned signals to indicate when to advance and when to retreat, turning our communication into a ballet of silence and precision. Each morning, I reminded myself of Ryan's face on the live broadcast and understood that the spectacle was far from the end.
Camilla's public firing hurt me more than I expected, not out of pride, but from seeing someone I trusted pay the price for following the truth. I provided safe shelter, legal counsel, and a protection strategy, all without fanfare. Revenge has cold ways of caring for its own. That forced separation forged in me a sharper sense of responsibility, to use the fortune I possessed not just to punish, but to shield the innocents who helped me. On long nights, I reviewed our steps on the attack map, adjusting so that collateral damage was as minimal as possible. The goal remained clear: topple Vasquez and reinstitute a kind of order that for me would only come with total exposure. As weeks passed, I noticed signs of cracks in the alliance holding the board together. Counselors who once smiled at dinners now avoided contact, and funds supporting the board hesitated to reaffirm commitments. I used private conversations, discreet meetings, and market pressures to amplify that distrust, because I knew an empire's fall begins when its allies wonder if it's worth continuing. Each planted doubt worked like a small underground explosion that, added to others, would open a crater. I remained relentless, but cold. Victory isn't for the hasty or the emotionally uncontrolled. I reinforced my share positions through investment vehicles that seemed banal on the public radar, and watched my percentage rise without fanfare. Hawthorne, weakened by the articles and restless internal auditors, began losing strategic contracts that once seemed untouchable. Suppliers and partners sought guarantees and avoided exposure. In parallel, without revealing my hand, I used compliance contacts to initiate external reviews that challenged past reports, an elegant way to bring to light flaws no one dared mention. Each move was designed to maximize impact and minimize direct correlation with me, always maintaining useful invisibility. Ryan tried to counterattack with speeches about innovation and future vision, but his words sounded hollow against concrete proof of manipulation. At a conference, I watched his confidence crack when incisive questions arose, and saw investors who once applauded him exchange smiles for distrust. That brought me a satisfaction as rational as it was dangerous, the feeling that the monster was human and therefore vulnerable. I exploited those moments of weakness to accelerate smaller acquisitions that combined would give me more influence in company decisions. I wasn't seeking just punishment, I sought enough control to prevent the story from repeating. Social media and financial forums began reproducing theories and leaked documents, and public pressure grew organically, exactly as I planned. Public opinion, by its nature, is volatile and treacherous, but when aligned with evidence, it becomes a powerful lever against corporate elites. Meanwhile, I protected my position with legal advisors and auditors who validated every step, reducing the chance that my strategy would fail due to technical flaws. I felt that the real test was yet to come, turning these tremors into an irreversible institutional rupture. At the end of an exhausting day, I reflected on the price every victory demands. There were nights when I wondered if I had become what I despised, others when I justified it all by exposing corruption. I turned those doubts into fuel and continued the work. The market game isn't raw simply because it's cruel, it's raw because it's efficient, and I was determined to use its efficiency to my advantage until the name Vasquez was just a record of a historical moral failure. Marcos asked to meet me in a warehouse converted into a loft, the kind of place where everyone pretends to live the risk and no one really runs danger. He arrived with a well-calculated smile and offered me a glass of wine as if closing a deal between gentlemen. It wasn't a gesture of trust, it was a test. I showed him the spreadsheets Claire had obtained and watched his reaction with surgical calm. When the smile faltered, I knew there were strings I still couldn't see. Marcos revealed, without beating around the bush, that some funds he worked with would profit immensely from Hawthorne's collapse, and that our fall could yield returns justifying any human loss. The feeling of betrayal was a sharp blow, not from surprise, but from the clarity that I had been a piece on a larger board. I left there colder than before. Understanding the other's game is the first step to winning it.
I reinforced digital security protocols and asked Claire to fragment the evidence into cracked copies. Redundancy was the new luxury. Meanwhile, I began probing the investor's link to Marcos, using discrete connections in investment banks that still owed me favors. I discovered that some contracts that seemed neutral were in fact suicidal bets disguised as insurance against systemic risk. Each discovery dismantled the script I had imagined and forced me to refine the strategy with even greater precision. There was, however, a cruel advantage. Knowing Marcos had his own interests, I could manipulate him indirectly. I planned to send controlled information to him, documents that would make him believe he was cooperating to amplify the crisis, while I consolidated stake and undermined his bets. It would be a game of mirrors, where the adversary saw himself reflected in false traits and ended up compromising publicly. Revenge, I learned, wasn't just exposing the truth. It was orchestrating the other's mistake until it became irrevocable.
I called a meeting with my lawyers and traced a path that protected them and allowed me to act. I gave clear orders, nothing that couldn't be written in a contract, nothing that could be traced directly to me without layers of shielding. Claire received the mission to maintain contact with journalistic sources, planting questions and testing market reactions. I would handle the acquisitions and financial engineering. In silence, I tightened the knots that would bind not just Vasquez, but anyone who bet on my ruin as business. The next play needed to be clean, bold, and final. I returned to the files I had helped assemble years ago and rediscovered the details of Project Aegis, like finding a suicide note hidden in an old book. There were signatures, merger terms, and especially clauses explaining why that $480 million portfolio existed. It was a cushion intended for high-risk research that should never be accounted for in the open books. By understanding the legal origin of the holding, I realized I possessed not just money, but a legal artifact capable of challenging the very structure sustaining the board. That discovery transformed my position from avenger to something more dangerous. I could now claim legitimacy, not just resentment. With this new understanding, I readjusted my strategy. I needed to secure greater stake before exposing the accounting folklore sustaining Hawthorne. I spent weeks gathering small parcels through trusts and obscure brokerages, becoming a discreet and influential investor. At the same time, I instructed Claire to compile a chronological dossier connecting every suspicious move by Vasquez to official documents. It was the glue that would make the narrative unquestionable. Each puzzle piece needed to fall into place with the dry sound of breaking porcelain, definitive and irreversible. While closing the last chair positions, I began preparing the ground for the shareholders' assembly that would change everything. I hired corporate governance experts to pose as public allies, people who could, without showing alignment with me, question the board in a technical and relentless way. I also provided channels for institutional investors to receive independent analyses on the risks I knew existed. The idea was to create pressure that seemed organic, not orchestrated. The tension grew like a taut rope. One snap, and the collapse would be visible to all. In the early morning before the assembly, I sat alone in my apartment and relived every moment that brought me there. The humiliation in the conference room, the Aegis file, the nights with Claire, Marcos's betrayal, and the image of Ryan I always recalled. It wasn't just hate driving me, it was the need to rewrite a story written by others. When I looked at the lit city, I felt a curious calm, the feeling of someone who planted a storm and now just waits for the rain to fall. Tomorrow, I thought, wouldn't be just about money. It would be about leaving a record that some privileges aren't invincible. The assembly began under a tense atmosphere, as if the room's air were made of gunpowder and every word could be the match that ignites it all.
Vasquez tried to open proceedings with that rehearsed tone of authority, but insecurity was visible even to the cameras. I, seated among the shareholders, watched with the serenity of someone controlling the script without needing to be on stage. My allies asked the right questions, and the falsified numbers began bleeding on the spreadsheets projected on the screen. With each embarrassed silence from Ryan, the share value dropped further, and with it, the entire board's reputation. While they sank in contradictory explanations, I received a short message from Claire. The evidence has been delivered to the press. In 30 minutes, it will explode. My heart raced, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline of the exact moment when truth becomes uncontrollable. Outside, reporters were already waiting, and when the articles started appearing on the screens, chaos ensued. Richard Vasquez stood up, trying to contain the damage, but his voice trembled. I remained quiet, drinking their fall in slow sips, while my control percentage rose silently in brokerages obeying pre-programmed orders. By late afternoon, the room was a field of debris. Investors demanded resignations, lawyers shouted legal terms, and Ryan couldn't hide the panic. I stood calmly and asked to speak. I said few phrases, all measured. Hawthorne can rise again, but not with the same mistakes nor the same names. The silence that followed was worth every humiliation I lived. I left there with the certainty that the empire had fallen. But, as every strategist knows, winning is easy. Holding the throne requires another kind of war. The following hours were a parade of headlines, phone calls, and ruins. The name Vasquez became synonymous with fraud, and Ryan, who dreamed of being the new face of the company, became the symbol of incompetence dressed as heritage. I already controlled 38% of the company, and the provisional board summoned me to discuss an emergency restructuring. I entered the room that had once been the scene of my firing, and for a moment felt the weight of the past pushing my shoulders. But this time, there was no anger, just calculation. I showed the documents, proposed a recovery plan, and demanded transparency. Everyone knew what that meant. I was in command. Richard tried to negotiate, beg, even appeal to memories of good times. I replied with a phrase that ended any dialogue. The loyalty you betrayed is what now condemns you. When I left the building, journalists surrounded the car, and the flash of cameras mixed with the sirens of federals entering the edifice. It was the perfect image of modern corporate justice, cold, aesthetic, and merciless. From inside the car, I looked in the mirror and for a second saw the reflection of someone I didn't recognize. Not the executive I was, nor the avenger I became. Just a man tired of playing clean in a world that doesn't know what honor is.
That night, I called Claire. I said the plan was complete, but there was no victory without a price. Part of my name was under investigation for indirect market manipulation, and she knew that could cost me years of legal battles. You destroyed an empire, she said in a low voice, and paid with your own peace. I smiled faintly and replied, peace was never the goal. Memory, yes. On the other end of the line, silence. Sometimes the end of war doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with the sound of someone who understands what was lost to win. In the following days, the corporate world turned into the stage for my name. Headlines, podcasts, interviews, reports, all wanted to understand how the man fired with dishonor became the architect of the most impactful fall in the market in years. I watched it all with a mix of pride and exhaustion. The federal investigation formally involved me, though, as a witness, and lawyers took turns in meetings that felt like trials. The irony amused me. The same ones who accused me of mismanagement now sought my technical opinion to repair the damage. Victory is a double-edged knife. It shines, but cuts deep.
Claire remained by my side through the chaos. She handled communication with shareholders and discreetly protected documents that exonerated me. When pressure mounted, she proposed publishing an open letter signed by both of us, detailing the irregularities and reaffirming our trust in the justice system. That became the turning point. The public began seeing in me not just the corporate avenger, but the man who exposed the structural rot of an empire. The accusations lost strength, and the narrative turned in my favor. For the first time, I felt I could breathe without fear of collapsing with the enemy. On a quiet morning, I received the news that marked the symbolic end of the war. Ryan had fled the country, and Vasquez, after a nervous breakdown, had surrendered to the authorities. Their empire dissolved in cheap shares and burned memories. I was cleared of suspicions and kept a fraction of the fortune, enough to start over without repeating the same mistakes. When I looked at Claire, she just said, "It's over." I didn't reply, because deep down I knew nothing really ends when power is involved. Revenge, I learned, has no period, just intervals. I temporarily assumed the presidency of Hawthorne during the transition process, but not out of vanity, for control. I wanted to ensure the company was returned to the market as a clean entity, without the rotten DNA that infested it. I reduced boards, dissolved inherited positions, and hired young talents without famous surnames. The new model was simple: merit over alliances, transparency over secrets. The irony, of course, didn't escape me. I, the man who orchestrated one of the greatest falls in history, now wrote a corporate ethics code. Maybe it was hypocrisy. Maybe it was redemption. Claire and I became partners in a fund focused on protecting corporate whistleblowers. We gave it the symbolic name Aegis Foundation, the same word that once was synonymous with corruption disguised as innovation. The foundation grew quickly, and within months I was receiving messages from executives willing to hand over similar schemes in their companies. With each new case exposed, I felt a strange kind of peace. Not silence, but the echo of knowing my story had become a tool. Claire said I was finally giving something good back to the world. I didn't know if I believed it, but I let her believe for me. One night, alone on top of a building in New York, I watched the lights reflecting on the skyscrapers and thought about everything left behind. Justice is cold, I thought, because it doesn't forgive. It just balances. I had paid with loneliness, guilt, and sleepless nights, but the price seemed fair. Below me, the world spun as if nothing had happened, and maybe that was the greatest reminder of all. Power forgets quickly, but the scars of those who challenged the system remain. I accepted them as medals from a warrior who won without needing applause. 3 years have passed since the fall of Hawthorne, and time, as always, has done its job of erasing tracks and rewriting narratives. The market stabilized, the Aegis Foundation grew, and I learned to live with the kind of silence that comes after wars, the one where internal noise replaces the sound of battles. I spent my days between meetings and lectures, talking about corporate ethics to audiences applauding a man who was once driven by revenge. Sometimes I wondered if they saw the paradox, but no one wanted an imperfect hero. They wanted a story that sounded redemptive, and I knew how to play it well enough to make it seem true. One afternoon, during a conference in Chicago, a familiar face emerged among the guests. The hair was shorter, the suit more discreet, but those eyes, cold, calculating, I would recognize anywhere. Ryan Mitchell, the man who started it all, standing a few feet from me, with the same half-smile of someone who knows more than he shows. I continued the lecture without breaking the flow, but inside, I felt the old survival instinct reignite, like a blade being polished after years stored away. When it ended, he approached me and said, with the calm that only contained rage possesses, "Nice speech, Ethan. It seems the story forgave you. Mine isn't over yet. That night, alone in the hotel, I looked out the window at the city lights and realized the cycle was about to restart. Ryan was no longer the naive young heir. He was a man shaped by the fall, and men shaped by hate learn quickly. A new name had emerged in the market, an aggressive startup called Helix Dynamics, acquiring companies with the same coldness I once took Hawthorne. Upon investigating, I discovered the CEO operated under a false identity, but the features were unmistakable. I smiled, not from fear, but recognition. Corporate war doesn't end, it just changes scenery and protagonists. And this time, perhaps it was he who held the cards.